People often remember Germany after the First World War through a single image. Paper money stacked higher than groceries, prices written on boards, then crossed out, then rewritten again. It looks chaotic, almost absurd, as if the entire country simply lost control of reality. But that image hides something important. Because when Germany first began printing money, it did not feel like a disaster. In fact, for a brief moment, it felt like relief. Workers were still being paid, shops were still open, the economy was still moving. From the outside, life appeared functional. This is where most stories rush ahead. They jump straight to collapse, to panic, to failure. But before any of that happened, there was a decision that seemed reasonable at the time. A decision that solved immediate problems, calmed immediate fears, and bought something every government desperately wants when pressure is rising: time. And the real question is not why Germany printed money, but why stopping ever became impossible. To understand why that time mattered so much, it helps to look at where Germany actually was after the war ended. The country had lost more than territory. It had lost confidence, stability, and trust, both from the outside world and from its own people. The old political order had collapsed, a new one was still fragile, and everyday life felt uncertain in ways that were hard to measure but impossible to ignore. Inside the country, pressure was constant. Millions of soldiers were returning home to an economy that struggled to absorb them. Factories needed to run, workers needed wages, and families needed food, even as resources were shrinking. Outside Germany, former allies and rivals watched closely, skeptical that the country could meet its obligations or even manage itself. The government sat in the middle of this tension. It had to prevent unrest at home while trying to maintain credibility abroad. Any sign of weakness risked strikes, protests, or political collapse. Any sign of defiance risked isolation and punishment from other nations that no longer trusted German promises. This was not a situation where leaders were choosing comfort or excess. They were responding to pressure from every direction at once, trying to keep basic systems functioning long enough for something more stable to take shape. Every delay, every temporary fix, carried the hope that conditions might improve before consequences arrived. But survival under this kind of pressure often comes with costs that are not immediately visible. The pressure Germany faced was not only about rebuilding its economy or calming its population, it was tied to a deeper constraint that shaped every decision the government made. Germany owed obligations that could not be met by simply keeping factories running or workers employed. It owed payments to other countries, and those payments were not expected in its own currency. What Germany was required to deliver was value that existed outside its control. Foreign governments demanded settlement in gold or in currencies that Germany did not issue and could not create at will. This distinction mattered far more than it appeared on paper. Printing money could pay wages at home, but it could not produce gold. It could not generate foreign currency. And it could not directly satisfy creditors who measured value by standards Germany no longer commanded. This created a constant imbalance. The more Germany tried to stabilize life inside its borders, the more pressure built from outside. Exporting goods brought in some foreign currency, but not enough, and often not fast enough. Borrowing provided temporary relief, but it deepened dependence and scrutiny. Each solution narrowed the room to maneuver. In effect, Germany was being asked to deliver something it could not fully control, on a schedule it could not slow, while maintaining order at home. The problem was not simply debt. It was that the debt existed in a form that ignored Germany's internal reality, leaving the government to bridge a gap that could not be closed through ordinary means. So the question quietly shifted from how to fix the situation to how to delay its consequences. With that gap growing wider, the government turned toward the one tool it still fully controlled. Printing money did not solve the larger obligation, but it allowed daily life to continue. Wages could be paid on time, public employees stayed at their jobs, factories kept operating, and basic services did not immediately break down. In a society already strained by loss and uncertainty, this mattered more than abstract warnings about the future. At first, the effects felt stabilizing rather than dangerous. Money circulated quickly, businesses reopened, and unemployment pressures eased. From the perspective of ordinary citizens, there was no sudden collapse, no clear signal that something was going wrong. Shops still had goods, trains still ran. The economy appeared to be functioning, even if imperfectly. For policymakers, this created a powerful incentive to continue. Each round of new currency bought a little more time, pushing unrest further into the future. The alternative was immediate contraction, layoffs, closed factories, and visible hardship that could trigger protests or political breakdown. Compared to that, printing money seemed like the least disruptive option available. What made this period especially deceptive was that stability itself became evidence. As long as workers were paid and businesses stayed open, the decision felt justified. There was no single moment where the policy announced itself as a mistake. Instead, it blended into everyday life, quietly becoming normal. But this sense of normality depended on something fragile. It depended on confidence that money would continue to hold its value tomorrow, even as more of it entered circulation today. And once that confidence began to thin, the surface calm could no longer hide what was building underneath. As more money entered the system, the changes did not arrive with alarms or headlines. They appeared gradually, almost politely. Prices shifted upward in small steps, not enough to shock, but enough to be noticed. A loaf of bread cost a little more than it had the week before. Rent adjustments came more frequently. Shopkeepers hesitated before rewriting price tags, unsure whether the change was temporary or something they would soon need to repeat. For many people, the experience was confusing rather than frightening. Wages were still being paid and employment still existed, so daily routines continued. But the value of those wages no longer felt stable. Savings that had been set aside for years seemed to lose weight without being touched. People began spending sooner, not out of panic, but out of quiet calculation, sensing that holding onto money carried its own risk. The middle class felt this most sharply. They were not wealthy enough to protect themselves through assets abroad, and not poor enough to rely entirely on immediate income. Their security depended on trust in steady prices and predictable value. And that trust was beginning to erode in ways that were difficult to explain but impossible to ignore. Nothing had collapsed yet. Shops still opened each morning. Trains still ran on schedule. The currency was still accepted. But beneath the appearance of normal life, confidence was thinning. Money still functioned as money, yet it no longer felt like something that could safely be saved or planned around. And once people begin to doubt the future value of money, their behavior starts to change in ways that are hard to reverse. The shift did not arrive as a single dramatic moment. There was no announcement, no clear line separating stability from collapse. Instead, people began to notice that prices no longer changed by the week, but by the day, then by the hour. What had once felt like a gradual inconvenience started to demand constant attention. Workers rushed to spend their wages as soon as they were paid, not because they wanted more, but because waiting no longer made sense. Money sitting still lost value faster than goods on store shelves. Employers adjusted pay more frequently, not as a benefit, but as a necessity, knowing that delays carried real consequences for their workers. Shops responded in kind. Price boards were updated repeatedly, sometimes several times a day. Transactions became hurried. The act of buying turned into a race against time, where the value of money depended less on what it represented and more on how quickly it could be exchanged for something tangible. What made this phase so unsettling was that the system itself was still operating. The currency was accepted, accounts were settled, markets existed, yet the underlying meaning of money was slipping away. It no longer served as a reliable measure of value or a dependable store of effort across time. Money had not disappeared. It had become unstable in a way that touched every decision, every purchase, every plan. And once people stopped trusting money to hold value even briefly, the pace of life began to change, pulling the entire economy into a state of constant motion that fed on itself. As the pace of change accelerated, the damage was felt most clearly by those who had played by the rules. People who had saved carefully, planned cautiously, and trusted that steady work would translate into long-term security found themselves exposed. Savings lost meaning not through a single loss, but through constant erosion, until years of effort no longer provided protection. The middle class carried this burden quietly at first. There were no dramatic collapses or visible markers of failure. Instead, there was a growing sense of unfairness, a feeling that stability itself had been quietly taken away. Promises that once felt solid now felt fragile, and the idea of planning for the future became difficult to sustain. What followed was not just financial stress, but psychological strain. When money stops functioning as a reliable reference point, everyday decisions become exhausting. People begin to question not only prices, but institutions, rules, and the expectations that had guided their lives. Trust, once lost, did not disappear all at once. It thinned gradually, leaving behind frustration and resentment. This anger was not always directed at a single policy or decision. It spread more broadly towards systems that no longer seemed to protect effort or reward patience. The social contract felt strained, even if it had not yet broken. And in that environment, certainty became more valuable than fairness, and simple explanations became more appealing than complex truths. The economic damage was real, but the deeper impact was the quiet shift in how people related to the system itself. By this point, the idea of simply stopping had become far more complicated than it sounded. Printing money was no longer just a policy choice. It had become a support structure holding the system together. Wages, contracts, public services, and daily transactions now depended on a flow that could not be interrupted without consequences arriving immediately. If the government slowed or halted money creation, prices would not gently stabilize. They would collide with a reality the economy was no longer prepared to face. Businesses that relied on constant price adjustments would fail. Workers would be paid in currency that no longer matched the speed of change. Unemployment and unrest would rise quickly, and the fragile political order would be tested all at once. Yet, continuing down the same path carried its own cost. Each new round of money reduced confidence further, forcing even faster spending and more aggressive adjustments. What had once been a temporary measure now required constant reinforcement, just to prevent the system from freezing or tearing itself apart. This is where the trap became clear. There was no option that preserved stability. One direction led to immediate collapse. The other delayed collapse while quietly deepening the damage. The choice was no longer between success and failure, but between different forms of failure unfolding on different timelines. From the outside, it can look like indecision or denial. From inside the system, it felt like managing a crisis that could not be resolved, only postponed, while hoping that something, anything, might change before the cost arrived in full. When the immediate crisis finally passed, the damage it left behind was not limited to prices or currency. What had been weakened most deeply was trust. Trust in money, yes, but also trust in institutions that were meant to provide stability, predictability, and fairness over time. Once that trust was shaken, it did not return quickly or easily. Rules that had once felt dependable now seemed conditional. Contracts felt fragile. Long-term planning felt naive. Even when conditions began to normalize, the memory of instability lingered, shaping behavior long after the original causes had faded. People became cautious in some ways and reckless in others, responding not just to current conditions, but to what they had learned was possible. This kind of damage does not show up immediately in statistics. It appears in hesitation, in shortened time horizons, in a preference for certainty over complexity. The economy may begin to function again, but the social fabric that supports it takes much longer to repair. What was lost was not only purchasing power, but a shared sense of reliability, the quiet assumption that effort today would translate into security tomorrow. And once that assumption is broken, it changes how a society understands risk, responsibility, and the future itself.